Hi everybody, and welcome to the fabulous cameras of the 1950s. I'm Laszlo Vasco. This is my Micro Adventures channel, and we're covering camera equipment from the 50s, which I think for many collectors is their favorite decade. The reason for that is that you have cameras that are really built to a very high standard. Competition was very large. Cameras were coming out 1 month after another. And there was a focus on precision, there was focus on innovation. And these are cameras that you could use just as well today as they were able to use back then. They compete, and they're just as good as I would say cameras from the 1980s, minus the fancy metering capabilities that came later on. But if you've got a great handheld light meter, or just a light meter app on your iPhone, then these are going to take just as good images as anything else that came later on. So let's jump into it and start with the folding cameras, which continue to be a thing, although I think this is sort of it's not the last decade that they were used, but they became very niche afterwards. But, starting with the Voigtlander Bessa one, which I've covered, before, but a beautifully made, starting to look quite modern, with a coated lens, 6x9 camera. And then moving on to Konica, the oldest photographic equipment manufacturer and film manufacturer from Japan, coming out with, their Pearl series. This is the Pearl 3. So the Pearl series started, to come out after World War II. But the Pearl 3, these are now, there's no red window. So it has automatic film advance mechanism, and ending up with the Pearl 4 with a very nice large viewfinder, for example, and now a sophisticated film advance that allowed you to advance the film to the next frame automatically, avoiding double exposure. And so this particular camera is, I think, with its very sharp Hexar coated lens, I would say is just as good as anything else that came later from Fuji, and hence very popular, collapses down to a nice portable way of taking medium format cameras with you. So continuing on with some 35mm folding cameras, the Voigtlander kicked off the decade with the Vito 2. But now it's starting to look a little bit more modern, but still a folding, leather bellows camera that was almost last in that series. But and of course they also had their rangefinder series with the Vitessa, and this was sort of, you could argue, top of the line now for folding leather bellows 35mm rangefinder cameras. It collapsed into this very nifty package and featured a very unique plunger type of film advance that was very rapid. So I'm zooming right through here because there's just so much to cover. But before we move on to the other 35mm cameras, let's jump back to medium format and cover the twin lens reflex cameras. Rolleiflex continued to come out with super great cameras, but they were getting stiff competition from Japan. The Minolta Autocord coming out with their first one in 55, and then this one with a attached built-in light meter, 1958. So this was as good as you were gonna get. It was just as good as Rolleiflex. And beautiful, precise instrument with a very sharp Rocord lens, giving Rolleiflex a great competition for their money. And there were many others from Japan. Olympus, for example, also had a wonderful twin lens reflex camera, or Ricoh. Yes, Ricoh is also another older Japanese brand, and they still make great, pocket digital cameras. But they came out with the Ricoh Auto 66. Now this is towards the end of the decade. That featured a coupled light meter, both right in. By the way, the other unique feature of this camera, you may have not seen, these are pretty rare. A lot of people are aware of the Autocords, but this one is a lot more of a unicorn, I suppose. And one of the reasons I picked it is because it has this bizarre look to it. The reason for that is instead of the whole lens assembly coming in and out for focusing, it has its lenses rotating and you know, moving in and out with this focusing lever. And then you cock the shutter and took the image. So great little camera. Rolleiflex, by the way, came out with something very similar. Same sort of focusing concept with a built-in light meter. All right, back to 35mm cameras. So, and back to the consumer cameras. Of course, Vito or Voigtlander then forego the folding concept and was coming out with their B series, Vito B series, small, consumer-oriented, but very high precision cameras. And then shortly thereafter, adding, you know, built-in light meters. These weren't yet coupled, so you had to read off the light meter and set it on your lens and adjust the shutter speed accordingly. But you know, I have, by the way, if you haven't seen them, my Voigtlander cameras, the 50s and 60s, take a look at this. They're fun to collect and fun to use. But the best Voigtlander, though, in terms of rangefinder cameras, was the Prominent. A hefty camera that is my favorite interchangeable rangefinder lens camera, especially because of its sort of steampunk look to it. So this was their first model coming out in 1952, and it's the one I like the best. There are later versions that had, so first they had a accessory shoe on top of it, ruining this beautiful look. And then it had a raised sort of top, allowing for a larger viewfinder with frame lines, which a lot better, of course, from a usability perspective, but again, in my opinion, ruining its look. So, and the reason I love this is because just listen to that precision. The way it winds, it doesn't have a lever. You got to wind it this way, but in later versions that had a lever. But anyway, it is just super neat. And then you can see the way it sort of winds the shutter right behind the lens assembly there, and super cool camera. And take a look at the video of my 1950s that I've covered this, and of course I don't have neither Leica nor Contax, but to me Voigtlander is just as quality, and both for their lenses and their bodies as well. Of course, these didn't quite make it longer term. But anyway, another camera that didn't make it longer term and was just as ambitious was Minolta's Super 8. So Minolta came out with 35mm rangefinder cameras right after World War II, modeled after Leica. But in the 1950s or 1957, they aimed for the top with the Minolta Super 8 interchangeable lens camera. And you can even hear that it's just not the same as the Prominent, but still, it's a nice shutter. And of course, great lenses from Ricoh. This is a 1.8 f1.8 lens on it, and a neat camera that had the ability to mount a accessory light meter that coupled right onto the shutter speed selector. So not, Canon, of course, I would argue Canon was the, Nikon and Canon, of course, were top of the rangefinders, but Nikon kind of stopped as they switched to their Nikon F SLR when they launched that at the end of the decade, and Canon continued a little bit longer. I don't have either of those rangefinder cameras, but because I collect Minolta cameras from Japan. But despite that, I do have the Olympus Ace. This is a camera you probably haven't heard of, and because it's Olympus's only rangefinder interchangeable lens camera, and it is similar to the trend they already started. It is slimmer, smaller, lighter, and more finely crafted than what came out from not just Minolta but Canon and others. And the other unique feature that I love with this one is the super tiny lens. Look how small this lens is. This is a 35mm lens, but it's even hard to handle. But the 50mm is just as small, and even their telephoto lenses aren't very big. And it also featured a leaf shutter, which is also sort of unique. So unlike the other interchangeable rangefinder cameras, which tended to have focal plane shutters, it had a leaf shutter, although so did the prominent. But this one has a fairly small throat. So the fastest lens you could get for this is indeed this, is 2.8. So there was, and hence why it was probably didn't quite take off. One more, the Kodak stereo camera, the only American camera I have from the 1950s. A pretty nifty, unique looking camera I found in an antique shop and picked up for next to nothing. But it took stereoscopic images on slide film that you could project. I won't be using this one because I don't think I'll be able to project it. But anyway, pretty neat innovation on the side. But let's finish off with the SLR camera. So, of course, I've already covered the fact that SLR single lens reflex cameras started to come out in the 1930s. Exacta and Praktica continue to evolve that genre. After World War II, of course, they were in East Germany, but they continued that evolution, coming out with more and more sophisticated single lens reflex cameras. Asahi Flex was the first Japanese single lens reflex camera, and also the first camera from Asahi itself, which later on, as they came up with the Pentax branding, got rebranded to be Pentax. So that came out in 1952, and that it continued to evolve with introducing things like a instant return mirror. So by the end of the decade, everybody was jumping in, and of course Nikon came out with the Nikon F, a groundbreaking professional camera in 1959, and so did Canon come out with a not so groundbreaking but professional attempt at a professional camera also in 1959. Some claim that this was in response to what others are doing, but that's just not possible in my opinion. This came out a month after the Nikon F, so obviously it was in design at the same time. Similar to the Nikon F, it had a removable pentaprism, and Canon had big ambitions to, have additional accessories. The whole camera flopped though. It had just an old way of setting apertures. It didn't allow for a coupled meter. It just had these stuck-on meters that would attach to the shutter speed dial. And it also featured an underside film advancement, which is actually pretty neat. So that's the reason I picked this camera, for its unique sort of industrial look. And actually, I love the underside film advance. But anyway, while that was a flop, it does make for a pretty cool collectible, in my opinion. Minolta's cameras that came out in '58, a year before that, were not a flop. Minolta came out with the SR2 in 1958, followed by the SR1, which was a lower end model with 1/500th of a speed setting. The SR2 didn't facilitate the addition of a light meter, unlike the SR1 and then SR3. So these, these looked identical. This is a slightly later version SR1, but this SR2 is literally exactly how the SR2 looked like. And coming out with a very successful mount. The SR mount lasted all the way into the 1980s until Minolta started coming out with autofocus SLR cameras. They were able to add on meter coupling, hence MC, and then the ability to facilitate programmed exposure, and those were the MD lenses. But it's actually the SR mount, not MC mount or MD mount that some people think. And it all started in 58 with, this is a modern camera, and it was their first SLR camera for Minolta, and for all intents and purposes, this is what they continue to look like. Last camera, and this isn't a modern SLR, but it's one of my favorites, the Voigtlander Bessamatic. This was a leaf shutter SLR camera, and leaf shutter SLR cameras were always a lot more complicated because it required you to, when you're taking a picture, for an SLR camera, unlike a rangefinder camera, you need to open up the shutter so that you can focus. So when you take a picture, the sequence was you have to close the shutter so that when you flip up the mirror, you don't expose the lens, the film. So you close the shutter, flip up the mirror, then you open the shutter, then you close the shutter when the exposure was finished, and then you lower the mirror. So a much more complicated arrangement than the focal plane shutters, which simply flipped up the mirror, ran the shutter, and flipped down the mirror. And the other drawback too is that with similar to the Olympus Ace, the other drawback too is that leaf shutter are just, they have to be in front of the mirror, and inherently they're small, so they limit how fast of a lens you can manufacture. Now the Bessamatic, the fastest lens you could buy for this system is f2, whereas already Canon right off the bat came out with f1.8. Minolta came out with the 58mm f1.4. Canon then came out with f1.2. So the race was on to enable fast lenses, and German manufacturers, not just Voigtlander, but the same was true for Zeiss, Kodak's Retina Flex series, which were also manufactured in Germany. They all had vested interest in continuing to use computer shutters, and that, in a sense, was their downfall, I think, because otherwise, they're just beautiful cameras. And I'll be reviewing this. As beautiful as it looks, it takes equally beautiful images, and hence one of my favorites. All right, great. So that's it for the 1950s. Please subscribe so that you could watch along as I do the reviews for many of these individually. I've had the pleasure to already use many of them, so I should be able to start posting maybe I'll couple a few of them together. But anyway, please subscribe and follow along. Thanks very much, and see you next time.